Testing one, two, three. Okay. Welcome. Weekly Marx, 25 October. Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, the original, I guess. This is the Marxist.org version, and the translation is the Ben Folks translation. This is the so-called third chapter, Capital in General. Note that the last week we've been looking at Dussel on this text, and as tedious as it may have seemed, I still think it's worth going through. And we'll go through the front part of this because the back part of it is kind of, how shall I say it? It's got a lot of numbers. Let's put it that way. So let us see if okay. The number one, the transformation of money into capital. MCM, the most general form of capital. Marx indicated that the section below was to be an addition to A. One 14, in order to develop the concept of capital, we must begin not with labor, but with value, V, big V, or more precisely, with the exchange value already developed in the movement of circulation. It is just as possible to pass directly from labor to capital, from the different races of men directly to the banker, or from nature to the steam engine. As soon as money is posited as exchange value, which not merely makes itself independent of circulation as in hoarding, but maintains itself inside it, it is no longer money, for money as such does not extend beyond the negative determination. It is capital. Hence, money is also the first form in which exchange value proceeds to the character of capital. And historically, it is the first form in which capital appears, being as a result historically confused with capital itself. For capital, circulation appears not only, as with money, as a movement in which exchange value vanishes, but also as a movement in which it is preserved and is itself the alienation of the two determinations of money and commodity. In simple circulation, in contrast, exchange value is not realized as such. It is always realized only in the moment of its disappearance. If the commodity becomes money and the money again becomes commodity, the exchange value determination of the commodity disappears. For it only served to obtain a quantity of the second commodity corresponding to the first commodity, the second commodity to the corresponding amount, whereupon the later commodity as a use value is swallowed up in consumption. The commodity becomes indifferent towards this form and ceases to be more than the direct object of need. If the commodity is exchanged for money, In simple circulation, in contrast, exchange value is not realized as such. It is always realized only in the moment of its disappearance. If the commodity becomes money, the money again becomes commodity. The exchange value determination of the commodity disappears. For it only served to obtain a quantity of the second commodity corresponding to the first commodity, the second commodity to the corresponding amount. Whereupon the latter commodity as a use value is swallowed up in consumption. The commodity becomes indifferent towards this form and ceases to be more than the direct object of need. If the commodity exchanged for money, the form of exchange value, money, it persists only as long as it stays outside exchange, puts itself in a negative relation to circulation. The imperishability money strove for by taking up a negative stance towards circulation is achieved by capital, in that the latter, that is capital, preserves itself precisely by self-abandonment to circulation. 1-14. So this is one sense of thinking about the generalization. Now, let us see about 1b, difficulties arising from the nature of value, etc. 1-7. The first, examine the form of capital in which it is directly presented or appears for observation. It can, however, be easily shown that the form M-C-M, value re-entering circulation, preserving and valorizing itself within it, seems utterly incompatible with the nature of money, the commodity and value in circulation itself. Circulation, in which the commodity is now represented as commodity, now as money, involves a change of form for the commodity. The manner in which its exchange value is represented changes, but the exchange value itself remains unaltered. The magnitude of its value does not change. It is not affected by this change of form. If we take a commodity, a ton of iron, for example, its exchange value, the labor time contained in it is expressed or represented in its price, say 3. If it is now sold, it is converted into 3, into the quantity of money indicated by its price. Money, which contains an identical amount of labor time. Now, it exists no longer as a commodity, but as money, as independent exchange value. The magnitude of value remains unaltered, being the same as the one in the one form as in the other. Only the form in which the same exchange value exists is altered. The change in the form of the commodity which constitutes circulation, buying and selling, has in itself nothing to do with the magnitude of the commodity's value. This magnitude is rather preposited to circulation as a given factor. The money form is merely another form of the commodity itself, in which no change takes place in an exchange value, except that it now appears in its independent form. But in the circulation C-M-C, that is selling in order to buy, there's a simple confrontation of commodity owners, one of whom possesses the commodity in its original shape, the other in its converted shape as money. Like the circulation C-M-C, the circulation M-C-M contains the two acts of sale and purchase and no more. The one starts with a sale and ends with a purchase. The other starts with a purchase and ends with a sale. Each of the acts of exchange needs only to be considered for itself in order to see that the sequence of these acts cannot change their nature in any way. In the first act, M-C, what we have called capital exists only as money. In the second act, C-M, it exists only as a commodity. In both acts, therefore, it can only have the effect of money and commodity. In the first, It confronts the other commodity owner as the buyer, the money owner, and the second as seller, commodity owner. Now, if we assume that through some inexplicable circumstance, the buyers have the opportunity of buying cheaper, i.e., buying the commodity at less than its value and selling it at its value or more than its value, our man is admittedly a buyer in the first act and would therefore buy the commodity at less than its value. But in the second act, that is C-M, he's a seller. And another commodity owner confronts him as a buyer. The latter would in turn have the privilege of purchasing the commodity from him at less than its value. Now, what he gained with one hand would be lost with the other. If, on the other hand, one assumes that he sells the commodity at more than its value, this being a privilege enjoyed by the seller, then in the first act, before he himself acquired the commodity in order to sell it later, someone else confronted him as the seller and sold him his commodity too dear. If they all sell their commodities, for example, 10% is too dear, i.e., at 10% over their value, and we have here only commodity owners confronting each other, whether they possess their commodities in the commodity or the money form. In fact, they will possess them alternately in one form than the other, then it will be exactly the same as if they sold them to each other at their real value. Similarly, if they all buy the commodities at, for example, 10% under their value, it is clear, insofar as one considers the simple use of the commodities, that both parties can gain by the exchange. In this sense, it can be said that exchange is a transaction in which both sides only gain. It says in De Stud de Tracy, immense theology, exchange, quote, exchange is an admirable transaction in which the two contracting parties always gain, both of them, unquote. To the extent that the whole circulation is only a mediating movement to exchange one commodity for the other, for another, each person alienates the commodity he does not need as a use value and appropriates the commodity he does need as a use value. They both gain from this process, therefore, and they only enter into it because they both gain. Yet another point, A, who sells iron and buys grain, possibly produces more iron over given labor time than the grain farmer B could produce in the same time. And B, for his part, produces more grain in the same labor time than A could produce. By means of the exchange, therefore, whether mediated through money or not, A receives more grain for the same exchange value, and B more iron than if the exchange not taken place, insofar as it is a matter of the use values, iron and grain, then both sides gain by the exchange. Similarly, if we regard each of the two acts of circulation, that is, buying and selling, in isolation and limit our consideration to use value, both parties gain. The seller who converts his commodity into money gains because he now has it for the first time in a generally exchangeable form, and only thus does it become general means of exchange for him. The buyer who converts his money back into a commodity gains because he's taken it out of this form, which is required for circulation but is otherwise useless, and turned it into a use value for himself. There is not the slightest difficulty in understanding, therefore, that both sides gain by the exchange insofar as it is a question of use value. It is entirely different with exchange value. Here, the reverse is the case. Where there is equality, there is no gain. Galliani della Motetta, Custodi, Autore, etc. Dove equaligate non lucro, where there is money, dove equalgit, equalgit, non lucro, it is clear that if A and B exchange equivalents, quantities of exchange value or objectified labor time of equal magnitude, whether in the form of money or commodities, they both bring back from the exchange the same exchange value as they threw into it. If A sells his commodity at its value, he now possesses, in the form of money, the same quantity of objectified labor time for a draft on the same quantity, which is for him in practice the same as he previously possessed in the form of the commodity, i.e., the same exchange value. The same holds good, but inversely for B, who has bought the commodity with his money. He now possesses, in the form of the commodity, the same exchange value as he previously possessed in the form of money. The sum of the two exchange values remains the same, as also the exchange value possessed by each of them. It is impossible that A should buy the commodity from B under its value and thus receive back in the commodity a higher exchange value than he gave B in money, while B simultaneously sells the commodity above its value and thus receives from A in the money form more exchange value than he gave in the commodity form. That is, A cannot obtain from B more corn than for the same quantity of cloth at the same time that B obtains from A more cloth than for the same quantity of corn. This is Bailey, a critical dissertation on the nature, measures, and causes of value, 1825, that commodities are exchanged in accordance with their value or with regard to the particular form of exchange which occurs in the circulation process, or sold and bought, means nothing more than that equivalents, that is, equal magnitudes of value are exchanged, replace each other, i.e., commodities are exchanged in proportion as their use values contain equal magnitudes of worked up labor time or quanta of labor of equal size. Close quote. It is, of course, possible that one person may lose what the other gains, with the result that the two exchangers are exchanging non-equivalents. Hence, one person will draw from the exchange a higher exchange value than he threw in, and indeed, precisely in the proportion in which the other person draws a lower exchange value from the exchange than he threw into it. Let us suppose that the value of 100 pounds of cotton is 100 shillings. If A now sells 150 pounds of cotton at 100 shillings to B, B has won 50 shillings, but only because A has lost 50 shillings. If 150 pounds of cotton with a price of 150 shillings, the price here is only its value expressed measured in money, are sold at 100 shillings, the sum of the two values is 250 shillings after the sale as well as before. Hence, the total sum of value present in circulation has not increased, has not valorized itself, has posited no surplus value. It has rather remained unaltered. All that has taken place within the exchange or by means of the sale is a change in the distribution of the value pre-posited to it, which existed before it and independently of it. 50 shillings have passed from one side to the other. It is therefore clear that the fraud which has occurred on one side or the other, whether committed by the buyer or the seller, does not increase the sum of exchange values present in circulation, whether they exist in the commodity or the money form, but only alters or changes their distribution among the various commodity owners. Let us assume in the above example that A sells 150 pounds of cotton with a value of 150 shillings to B for 100 shillings, and B sells it at 150 shillings to C. In this way, B gains 50 shillings, or it appears that his value of 100 shillings has posited a value of 150. But, in fact, the same amount is present after the transaction as before it. 100 shillings in A's possession, 150 in B's, commodities to the value of 150 shillings in C's. Summa summarum, the grand total, is 400 shillings. Now, originally there were present commodities to the value of 150 shillings in A's possession, 100 shillings in B's, 150 in C's. Summa summarum, 400 shillings. No further change has taken place except the change in the distribution of the 400 shillings between A, B, and C. 50 shillings has traveled from A's pocket to B's, and A has become poorer precisely to the extent that B has been enriched. Now, what applies to one sale and one purchase applies equally to the sum total of all values of to the sum total of all sales and purchases. In short, to the whole of the circulation of commodities taking place between the whole of the owners of commodities within any period of time. If one commodity owner or a number of them take advantage of the rest and thereby draw a surplus value from circulation, its quantity can be measured exactly by the reduction in value drawn from circulation by the other commodity owners. Some of them extract more value from circulation than they threw in because, and to the extent that the others extract less values, suffer a deduction from, a lessening in the value they originally laid out. The sum total of existing values is not thereby altered, only their distribution. Quote from J.B. Say, the exchange of two equal values neither increases nor diminishes the amount of the values available in society, nor does the exchange of two unequal values change anything in the sum of social values, although it adds to the wealth of one person what it removes from the wealth of another. Now, if we take all the capitalists of a country and the sum total of purchases and sales between them, among them, in the course of a year, for example, one capitalist may admittedly defraud the other and hence draw from circulation more value than he threw in, but this operation would not increase by one iota the sum total of the circulating value of the capital. Now, in other words, the class of capitalists taken as a whole cannot enrich itself as a class. It cannot increase its total capital or produce a surplus value by one capitalist gaining what another loses. The class as a whole cannot defraud itself. The sum total of capital in circulation cannot be increased by changes in the distribution of its individual components between its owners. Operations of this kind, therefore, however large a number of them one may imagine, will not produce any increase in the sum total of value, any new or surplus value, or any gain on top of the total capital in circulation. Now, to say that equivalents are exchanged is, in fact, to say nothing more than that commodities are exchanged at their exchange value, that they are bought and sold and bought at their exchange value. Quote, and in fact, quoting Marx himself, in fact, the exchange value of one commodity expressed in the use value of another commodity represents equivalence. That's 1859, Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy. Close quote. Now, where exchange has developed into the form of circulation, however, the exchange value of the commodity is expressed by means of the price in money, the material of the commodity which serves as the measure of values and hence as money. Its price is its exchange value expressed in money. Therefore, the fact that it is sold in return for an equivalent in money means nothing more than it is sold at its price, i.e., its value. Similarly, in the case of a purchase, the money buys the commodity at its price. Here, the identical sum of money, the prerequisite that commodities are exchanged for their equivalents, is the same as they are exchanged at their value, bought and sold at their value. Now, two things follow from this. Firstly, if the commodities are bought and sold at their value, equivalents are exchanged. The value cast by each hand into circulation returns back from circulation into the same hand. It is therefore not increased, is not affected at all by the act of exchange. Capital, i.e., value which valorizes itself in and through circulation, i.e., increasing value, value which posits a surplus value, would thereby be impossible if the commodities were bought and sold at their value. Let me repeat that. This is the first condition, right? Capital, i.e., value which valorizes itself in and through circulation, i.e., increasing value, value which posits a surplus value, would thereby be impossible if commodities were bought and sold at their value. Now, secondly, if, however, commodities are not sold or bought at their value, this is only possible, and altogether non-equivalence can only be exchanged if one side takes advantage of the other, i.e., if one person receives through the exchange exactly as much more than the value he laid out as the other receives less than the value he laid out. But the sum total of the values exchanged is not thereby altered, and no new value has therefore arisen through the exchange. A possesses 100 pounds of cotton to the value of 100 shillings. B buys it for 50 shillings. B has gained 50 shillings because A has lost 50 shillings. The total sum of values before the exchange was 150 shillings. It is the same after the exchange, but B owned 1/3 of this sum before the exchange, and afterwards he owns 2/3. A, in contrast, owned 2/3 before the exchange and only owns 1/3 afterwards. All that has happened, therefore, is a change in the distribution of the sum of values, 150 shillings. The sum itself has remained unchanged. Now, according to this, capital, that is self-valorizing capital, will once again be impossible as a general form of wealth. As in the first case, since an increase of value on the one side would imply a corresponding reduction of value on the other, hence the value as such would not rise. In circulation, one value would only increase because the other value declined, hence was not even maintained. It is therefore clear that exchange as such, whether in the form of direct barter or in the form of circulation, leaves the values cast into it unchanged. That is, adds no value. Quote, Whalen, 1843, exchange confers no value at all upon products. Even so, one still meets with a nonsensical assertion, even from renowned modern economists, that surplus value as such derives from things being sold dearer than their purchase price. Thus, for example, Mr. Torrens, quote, effectual demand consists in the power and inclination on the one part of the consumers to give for commodities, either by immediate or circuitous barter, some greater portion of all the ingredients of capital than their production costs. It's Torrens, 1821, close quote. Here, we merely have seller and buyer before us. The question whether the commodity owner, that is the seller, has produced the commodity by himself, and whether the other, the buyer, whose money, however, must have originated from the sale of commodities, is only their converted form, wants to buy the commodity for consumption. To buy it as a consumer does not alter the relation in any way. The seller always represents use value. The economist's phrase, reduced to its essential content and with its incidental accoutrement stripped off, means nothing more than this, that all buyers buy the commodities at more than their value. Hence, the seller in general sells his commodity at more than its value, and the buyer always buys at less than the value of his money. To bring in the producer and the consumer does not alter things in the least, for they do not confront each other in the act of exchange as producer and consumer, but as buyer and seller. And yet, where the individuals exchange solely as commodity owners, each of them must be both producer and consumer, and each can be only the one insofar as he is the other. Each would lose as buyer what he gains as seller. Now, on the one hand, then, if a surplus value, as we can still call every form of gain here, is to emerge from the exchange, it must have already been present before the exchange as a result of some act which is, however, invisible, not perceptible in the formula M-C-M. Now, profit, this is Ramsey, quote, profit, this is a special form of surplus value, is in the usual condition of the market, is not made by exchanging. Had it not existed before, neither could it after that transaction. This is Ramsey in 1836. Now, Ramsey says in the same place, quote, the idea of profits being paid by the consumers is assuredly very absurd. Who are the consumers? Etc. Now, there are only commodity owners facing each other, each of whom is just as much a consumer as a producer, and each of them can only be the one to the extent that he is the other. But if one thinks, anticipating of classes which consume without producing, even so, their wealth can only consist of a share of the commodities of the producers, and one cannot explain the increase in value by saying that classes which are given values for nothing are defrauded when an exchange is made in return for those values. See Malthus. The surplus value or the self-valorization of value cannot arise from exchange, that is, from circulation. On the other hand, value which as such creates value can only be a product of exchange, of circulation, for only in exchange can it function as an exchange value. Now, in itself, isolated, it would be a hoard, and as such, it no more valorizes itself than it serves as a use value. Or if, for example, one were to say the money owner buys the commodity, but he works on it, applies it productively, and in that way adds value to it, and then in turn sells it. The surplus value would have arisen entirely and exclusively from his labor. The 1950s hot rod, maybe. Value as such would not have functioned, would not have valorized itself. He does not obtain more value because he has value. The increase of value comes instead from the addition of labor. Now, in any case, if capital is a specific form of wealth, a potentiality of value, it must be developed on the basis that equivalents are exchanged, i.e., that the commodities are sold at their value, i.e., in proportion to the labor time contained in them. Now, this seems impossible, however. If equivalents are exchanged for each other in M-C-M, both in the act M-C and in the act C-M, how can more money emerge from the process that went into it? The investigation of the origins of surplus value has, therefore, formed the most important problem of political economy from the physiocrats to the present day. It is, in fact, the question of how money, or the commodity, as money is only the converted form of the commodity, a sum of values in general, becomes transformed into capital, how capital originates. Now, the apparent contradictions which lie in the problem and the conditions of the task led Franklin to the following utterance, quote, there are only three ways of increasing the riches of the state. The first is by war. That is robbery. The second is by commerce. This is cheating. And the third is by agriculture. This is the only honest way. This is Ben Franklin, Volume 2, Positions to be Examined Concerning National Wealth. Now, Here, one can already see why two forms of capital, that is, merchants' capital and users' capital, that correspond most closely to the ordinary conceptions of capital, and are, in fact, historically the oldest forms of existence of capital, capital in two functions. For its appearance as a particular form of capital depends on whether it functions in one form or the other, do not come into consideration here at all. For we are dealing with capital as such, but must rather be developed later as derived secondary forms of capital. The movement M-C-M is shown most clearly in merchants' capital proper. It was therefore realized at an early stage that its purpose is to increase the value of the money cast into circulation, and that the form in which this is achieved is through buying in order to sell again. Recall my comments on Italian banking. Quote, all the orders of merchants have in common is that they buy in order to resell. This is Der 1844 on Œuvre de Tougot. On the other hand, surplus value appears here to originate purely in circulation, in that this merchant sells dearer than he buys, whether by buying cheaper than he sells, that is, buying the commodity at less than its value and selling it at or above its value, or by buying the commodity at its value but selling it above its value. He buys the commodity from one person, sells it to another, representing money to the one and the commodity to the other. And when he begins the movement all over again, he sells in order to buy, but the commodity as such is never his goal, the latter movement serving only as a mediation for the first. Used car dealers, right? He alternately represents the different sides, that is, the phases of circulation towards the buyer and the seller, and the whole of his movement falls within circulation, or rather, he appears as its vehicle. Yes, irony, as the representative of money, just as in simple commodity circulation, the whole movement seems to proceed from the medium of circulation, that is, from money as a medium of circulation. What's burning a hole in your pocket? He appears only as the intermediary of the different phases the commodity has to pass through in circulation, and he therefore mediates only between available extremes, available buyers and sellers who represent available commodities and available money, since no other process in this case is added here to the circulation process. The surplus value, that is profit, the merchant makes by alternately selling and buying for all his operations to be reduced to sales and purchases, the increase in the money or value brought by him into circulation seems to be explained purely by his taking advantage of the parties with whom he is alternately concerned. The explanation appears to lie in the exchange of non-equivalents, whereby he always draws out of circulation a greater value than he puts into it. His gain, the surplus value created for him by the value he has brought into the exchange, thus appears to stem exclusively from circulation, and hence only to be made up of the losses of the people trading with him. Now, merchant wealth can, in fact, originate purely in this manner, in the wealth of the trading peoples which conduct a carrying trade between industrially less developed nations originated to a large extent in this manner. Merchants' capital can act between nations standing at very diverse stages of production and of the economic structure of society in general. It can therefore act between nations where the capitalist mode of production does not occur, hence long before capital is developed in its main forms. But if the gain made by the merchant or the self-valorization of the merchant's wealth is not merely to be explained by his taking advantage of the commodity owners, if therefore it is more than just a different distribution of previously existing sums of value, it must evidently be derived from prerequisites which do not appear in its movement, in its specific function and its gain. Its self-valorization appears as a purely derivative secondary form, the origin of which must be sought elsewhere. Indeed, if its specific form is viewed independently for itself, commerce must appear, in Ben Franklin's words, as mere cheating. And if equivalents or exchange of or commodities are sold and bought at their exchange value, it must appear altogether impossible. Quote, under the rule of invariable equivalence, commerce would be impossible. That's his Opdyke, a treatise on political economy of 1851. Hence, this is a bracket, hence, Engels, in his Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, 1844, sought in a similar fashion to explain the difference between exchange value and price by saying that commerce was impossible as long as commodities were exchanged at their value, close bracket. Another form of capital, similarly age-old, is money lent out at interest, interest-bearing money capital, from which popular opinion has taken its concept of capital. Here we do not see the movement M-C-M, the exchange of money for the commodity, followed by the exchange of the commodity for more money. All we see is the result of the movement M-M. There's no C, right? Money is exchanged for more money. It returns to its starting point, but augmented. If it was originally $100, it is now 110. The money, the value represented by the $100, has preserved and valorized itself as it deposited a surplus value of $10. We find interest-bearing money. We find interest-bearing money, money that posits money, formally, therefore, capital in almost all countries and epochs of history. However primitive the mode of production of the society and however undeveloped its economic structure, one side of capital is still closer here to the popular conception than was the case with merchants' wealth. Namely, the Kleptonov, right? Namely, the fact that value, as such, valorizes itself, posits surplus value because it enters into circulation, already exists previously as value, independent value money, and that in general, value is only posited. And the original value is only preserved. And the original value is only preserved and multiplied because value, that is, value as value, was pre-posited because it functions as self-valorized. It is sufficient to remark here, and we shall return to this on another occasion. Firstly, if money is lent out as capital in the modern sense of the word, it is already assumed that money, the sum of value, is in itself capital, i.e., that the person to whom the money is lent can or will apply it as productive capital, as self-valorizing value, and will have to pay a portion of the surplus value thereby created to the person who has lent him the money as capital. Here, then, interest-bearing money capital is manifestly not only a derived form of capital, capital in a particular function, but capital is assumed to be already fully developed, so that now a sum of value, whether in the money or the commodity form, for M-C, can be lent as capital, not as money, and commodity, i.e., capital itself, can be thrown into circulation as a commodity sui generis, that is, of a special kind. Hence, or here, capital is already presupposed in finished form as the power of money or the commodity of value in general so that it can be thrown into circulation as this potentiated value. Interest-bearing money, capital in this sense, therefore already assumes the development of capital. The capital relation must already be complete before it can appear in this specific form. The self-valorizing nature of value is here already presupposed as rooted in it, so that a sum of value could be sold as self-valorizing value, disposed of to a third person on certain conditions. Similarly, interest appears then merely as a particular form and branch of surplus value, just as the latter divides it altogether later on into different forms which constitute different kinds of revenue, such as profit, rent, interest. All questions about the magnitude of the interest, etc., therefore appear as questions of the distribution of the available surplus value between different sorts of capitalists. The existence of surplus value as such is presupposed here. In order that money or commodities, a sum of value in general, may be lent as capital, capital is already so far presupposed as a specific potentiated form of value, such that just as money and commodities are presupposed as material elements over and against capital in general, the capital form of value is here presupposed as the identical inherent quality of money and commodities, so that money or commodities can be made over as capital to a third person, since commodities or money are not developed as capital during circulation, but can instead be cast into circulation as finished capital, as capital in itself, as a particular commodity, which also has its own particular form of alienation. Let me break here for a second and suggest, okay, so let's say you talk about a third person effect. Is a third person effect a form, quote unquote, of interest, or the variants, become that? Anyway, back to the text. On the basis of capitalist production itself, therefore, interest-bearing capital appears as a derived secondary form. Secondly, we had firstly and secondly, interest-bearing money appears as the first form of interest-bearing capital, just as money in general appears as the starting point of capital formation, since value first becomes independent in money. Hence, the increase in money initially appears as an increase in value in itself. And in money, the standard is available for the measurement of first the value of all commodities, but then the self-valorization of value. Money can now be lent out to productive purposes, hence formally as capital. Although capital has not yet taken control of production, there is no capitalist production yet. Hence, no capital exists yet in the strict sense of the word, whether because production takes place on the basis of slavery or the surplus products belongs to the landlord, as in Asia and in feudal times, or craft industry or peasant economy and the like is the rule. This form of capital is therefore just as independent of the development of the stages of production as merchants' wealth, the only presupposition being that the circulation of commodities has receded far enough to create money, and hence appears historically before the development of capitalist production, on the basis of which it is only a secondary form. Like merchants' wealth, it only needs to be formally capital in a function in which it could exist before it has taken control of production. The latter, capital alone, is the basis of an historical mode of social production of its own. Thirdly, money can be borrowed, just like commodities, for buying, not for productive employment, but for consumption, to expend it. In this case, no surplus value is formed. There is merely a change in distribution, a displacement of the available values. Fourthly, money can be borrowed for payment. Money can be borrowed as a means of payment. This is done to cover debts arising out of consumption. It is the same case as 3, the only difference being that their money is borrowed to buy use values. Here, it is to pay for use values which have been consumed. But the payment may be required as an act of the circulation process of capital, that is, discount. The examination of this case belongs in the doctrine of credit. Now, after this digression, back to the subject. In developing capital, it's important to keep in mind that the sole prerequisite, the sole material we start out from, is commodity circulation and money circulation, commodities and money, C&M, and that individuals only confront each other as commodity owners. The second prerequisite is that change of form the commodity undergoes in circulation is only formal, i.e., that in all forms the value remains unchanged, that although the commodity exists at one time as the use value and the next time as money, there's no alteration in the magnitude of its value, that the commodities are therefore bought and sold at their value in properties to the labor time contained in them. In other words, that equivalents alone are exchanged. Of course, if one looks at the form C-M-C, one finds here too that the value is preserved. It exists first in the form of the commodity, then in that of money, then in that of the commodity again. For example, if a ton of iron is sold at a price of 3, the same 3 then exists as money, and after that as wheat at a price of 3. The magnitude of the value 3 has therefore been preserved in this process, but the grain as a use value now drops out of circulation into consumption, and with this, the value is annihilated. Now, even though the value is preserved in this case, as long as the commodity stays in circulation, there appears a purely formal matter continued in the addendum to section A. So that's where the thing at the top fits in, that we read before. And so if we go back to we've just discussed difficulties arising from the nature of value. Now we're close to the end of our time today. Let me apologize if there was any confusion or where we started. We are in notebook number 1, the transformation number 1, the title being Transformation of Money into Capital. And this is from A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 3rd chapter, Capital in General, and from August 1861 to March 1862, and after a little bit of time, January to July 1863. Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Now, there's other matters that we will get to, but it's still useful to look at the original kind of form of all of this. So, anyway, noting, of course, that we're going to do more of this tomorrow. So we will be back reading this further. That is, we'll begin C, exchange with labor, labor process, valorization process. Marx hasn't completed talking about, there's a lot missing in this first part of the explanation, right? But he's trying to set up the case by which the variance that's kind of important from a subjective point of view is, who are the buyer and seller? What are their sustenance sort of needs or requirements? And noting that there is differentiation among this. And from that simple set of relations, that is class relations, that's kind of where we get antagonism, right? So anyway, that's kind of where we're going. And we return to this in somewhat later form. So I'm going to shut off the